Good evening.
About you first, or just go right into your reading?
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? And a little bit of
Yeah.
echo. Echo. Can someone take care of the echo? One sec. We have a little echo. A little bit of reverb. I was never good in AV, to be honest, but someone is taking care of it. But as I speak, hopefully it'll be getting better and better and better. I'm Mitchell Kaplan. I want to welcome all of you tonight to this very, very special event. As you know, I see so many familiar faces. We do a lot of different events here at Books and Books and often all around the community. If you want to find out about the different events that we're doing, make sure that you sign up for our email newsletter at booksandbooks.com, and we'll send you emails, lots of them. So you'll really know what's going on. Also, because of a wonderful grant that we got from the Knight Foundation, we have partnered with UA Media to create live-streamed events. So this event, along with many of our other events, are being live-streamed. So think of good questions to ask during the Q&A. And at the same time, if you're sitting next to somebody you shouldn't be sitting next to, the camera roams a little bit. So just be aware of that as well. But we're very proud of that, and we're very proud of all the different events that we're doing. But tonight is one that's very special for me on a lot of different levels. Not only is Eric Weiner just a remarkable reporter, remarkable writer, but we also, even though he doesn't live in Miami at this point, we claim him as one of our own. Eric, this is a book called The Geography of Bliss. And I want you to know that I knew about this probably before anyone else, except maybe his wife and his editor, because Eric wrote most of this book sitting in our cafe. I remember seeing some guy typing away and going, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm writing a book." And it's really very heartening when a community bookstore can also become a place that furthers culture in the way that Eric does. And this book, as you know, went on to become a bestseller and went on to become a very, very important book along those lines. He, beyond The Geography of Bliss, he also wrote the very critically acclaimed Man Seeks God. As I said before, he worked with NPR and the New York Times, and his work appears everywhere in the New Republic, Slate, the LA Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, and he's also been anthologized in the Best American Travel Writing, too. Tonight we're celebrating this wonderful new book, which makes so much sense. It's called The Geography of Genius, A Search for the World's Most Creative Places, from Ancient Athens to Silicon Valley. I have no idea why he's in Miami if he's written this book, but I'm just kidding. We all know that there is a kind of genius developing here in Miami as well. And as he's got some remarkable testimonials from people of all different sorts. But as a little special treat, when I win the $1 billion tonight, if you buy this book, if 1.5, but I'll take the payoff. But when you buy this book, I promise I will reimburse you. So make sure you think long and hard about buying this book. Also, recently I've come to know another person who has become a friend over a very short period of time, and we're so happy to have her in our community. Eric will be in conversation with Eileen Prusher. She's a writer, multimedia journalist, and lecturer. She's worked in international journalism for well over 2 decades, having been based in Jerusalem, Istanbul, Tokyo, and Kabul. In the fall of 2015, just a few months ago, she joined the faculty of FAU, Florida Atlantic University, as a journalism instructor, and she's been recently named a fellow in the College of Arts and Letters, Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Initiative. Her most recent works of journalism have appeared in the New York Times, Book Review, Time, and La Haaretz. I also know that she also had a marvelous podcast that came out of Tel Aviv, which was about writing, and she's written a novel, which you'll hear about in a couple of months when she comes and presents that at the store as well. So please give a warm Books and Books Miami welcome to Eric Weiner and Eileen Prusher.
That's great.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. Thank you, Mitch, and thank you to this community that is already making me feel at home in Miami and South Florida. It's really exciting to be here for all kinds of reasons. As you just heard, Eric worked on his first book here, and I'm always excited to talk about anyone's new book. And you would think, sometimes you'd wonder, a writer's envious that someone else wrote something, but when it's a writer you really respect, who also happens to be a friend,
writers are never envious.
Never, yeah. Never. We're never. We're really we're glad for each other. I have to just give a little background as why the two of us we're paired for this event. In addition to when Mitch mentioned that Eric was coming, and I said, "Oh, Eric's a friend." We met in Jerusalem, being based there. Sorry to date us, but it's close to 20 years ago. And also covered
AD,
Japan.
Still AD.
Still, what's that?
AD.
Still AD.
Yeah.
Quite a while ago.
Yeah.
And then also covered Asia together. Had times when we were both covering, an upheaval in the Philippines, the overthrow of the Taliban in Afghanistan. So our paths were always crossing. And the one thing that I really admire about Eric, that I have to tell as a quick little opening anecdote, is that he always knew that there was the story that needed to be covered. He was a staff correspondent for NPR. It's an important job wherever you go in the world. But in addition to that, he was always wanting a little bit more, wanting to know what's the story behind the story. What are the people in this place about besides that story that you're going to read that's going to lead the newspaper that day or be at the top of the hour, on All Things Considered. And we were once in Korea supposedly covering this North-South Korea reconciliation process, and he said, I want to go meet a Korean shamanist. You want to just pop over and meet a shamanist? And it was someone who dressed up in interesting clothes of ancestors and took me very, very off the beaten track. And I think that kind of searching mind that you have, Eric, is what I think has allowed you and enabled you to sort of rise above, beyond being a reporter and becoming a true writer and someone who is really a public intellectual, really, who's asking the right questions. So I'm honored to be here with you celebrating the launch of your book.
Wow, that is so nice. Thank you. I like the way you say we were supposedly covering the North-South.
Yeah, but it was sort of like, we were kind of covering political things, and they said, let's just take a little day trip to meet a shamanist,
Those are the best stories.
Those were the best stories, and they're the ones you remember more than that North-South process that unfortunately didn't go anywhere. We thought it would be a great idea if you would read a little bit from the book for starters, to give people a sense of the geography of genius. Show, don't tell. It's Journalism 101. Yeah.
Just a little appetizer, and then we'll, I guess, return to our conversation. But this will give you a flavor of the book. So this is chapter 1. I've just arrived in Athens. And again, I'm on the hunt for creative genius around the world. The light. Maybe it was the light. The thought shimmies into my sleep-starved brain, strutting with the awkward bravado of a tweedy classicist on crack. Yes, I think, blinking away the hours of stale Boeing air, the light. Most light doesn't do much for me. It's nice, don't get me wrong, preferable to darkness, sure, but strictly utilitarian. Not the light in Greece. Greek light is dynamic, alive. It dances across the landscape, flickering here, glowing there, constantly and subtly shifting in intensity and quality. Greek light is sharp and angular. It's the sort of light that makes you pay attention. And as I would soon learn, paying attention is the first step on the road to genius. As I glance out my taxi window, shielding my eyes from the painfully bright morning sun, I can't help but wonder, have I found a piece of the Greek puzzle? I hope so, for it is a daunting puzzle, one that has stumped historians and archaeologists, not to mention the Greeks themselves, for centuries. The question that nags is this: why? Or, more precisely, why here? Why did this well-lit but otherwise unremarkable land give rise to a people unlike any other the world had seen? A people, as the great classicist Humphrey Keto put it, not very numerous, not very powerful, not very organized, but who had a totally new conception of what human life was for, and showed for the first time what the human mind was for. It didn't last long, this incredible flourishing. Golden ages never do. Ancient Greece. As the taxi slows to a crawl, rush hour traffic not being something the ancients had to contend with, I ponder those two words, ancient Greece. They make me shrink, embarrassed by how much I don't know, bored with the little I do. When I think of the Greeks, if I think of them at all, images of gray men joylessly pondering life's imponderables spring to mind. What can they possibly do for me? I have bills to pay and emails to send and deadlines to meet. The ancient Greeks seem about as relevant to my life as the rings of Saturn or trigonometry. Not for the first or last time, I am wrong. The truth is, no ancient peoples are more alive, more relevant today than the Greeks. We are all a little bit Greek, whether we know it or not. If you've ever voted or served on a jury or watched a movie or read a novel or sat around with a group of friends drinking wine and talking about anything from last night's football game to the nature of truth, you can thank the Greeks. If you've ever had a rational thought or asked why or gazed at the night sky in silent wonder, then you have had a Greek moment. My taxi stops in front of a tired 3-story building that, except for a small sign that says Tony's Hotel, is indistinguishable from all the other tired 3-story buildings. I step into the alleged lobby, a white-tiled room that looks more like someone's basement, piled high with rickety chairs, broken coffee machines, possessions you no longer need, but out of sentimentality or inertia can't bear it apart with. Like Greece itself, Tony's Hotel has seen better days. So has Tony. The Greek sun has etched deep lines onto his face. The Greek cuisine has inflated his gut to monumental proportions. Tony is all rough edges and sweetness, a throwback to an older drachma Greece, less euro, more endearing. I plop down on my bed and thumb through the small library of books I've packed, a whimsical collection curated from the vast ocean of ink that ancient Greece has spawned. My eyes are drawn to a quirky little volume called Daily Life in Athens at the time of Pericles. It's a pleasing antidote to the usual history, which is written from a mountaintop and is as dry as a desert. Historians typically track wars and upheavals and sweeping ideological movements like so many weather systems. Most of us, though, don't experience weather that way. We experience it down here, not as a massive low-pressure system, but as sheets of rain that slicken our hair, a crack of thunder that rattles our insides, a Mediterranean sun that warms our face. And so it is with history. The story of the world is not the story of coups and revolutions. It is the story of lost keys and burnt coffee and a sleeping child in your arms. History is the untallied sum of a million everyday moments. Within this quotidian stew, genius quietly simmers. Sigmund Freud nibbling on his favorite sponge cake at Vienna's Café Landmann. Einstein staring out the window of the Swiss patent office in Bern. Leonardo da Vinci wiping the sweat from his forehead at a hot and dusty Florentine workshop. Yes, these geniuses thought big, world-changing thoughts, but they did so in small spaces, down here. All genius, like all politics, is local. So, thank you. There's more in there. There's more.
That's a wonderful taster to whet our appetites for this book. I think the most logical place to start that I know probably a lot of people are curious about is, we wonder about the nature of genius, and is it something that we're meant to believe that, geniuses are just, born with sort of natural abilities, or does the society around them sort of bring them up and declare them a genius? Is it nature, nurture? Is it something in between? And what does geography have to do with it?
Good question. I think the first myth of genius is that they're born. This is what probably a lot of us here believe, that, some people just got it and others don't. And if you've got it, great. I mean, the sort of personification of this myth is Mozart, right? He was playing the piano at age 3. He was composing by age 7 or 8. And so, of course, we think he was born that way. And the truth is that genetics play a relatively small role, maybe 10 to 20% is what psychologists estimate. And so then we have another myth around genius, and that's that geniuses are made through hard work. It's all sweat. Edison famously said genius is 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. More recently, there's the very popular 10,000-hour rule, which some of you may be familiar with, this notion that you need to put in at least 10,000 hours across 10 years to achieve mastery, if not genius. So I don't mean to diminish either of those. Genetics do matter. Hard work does matter. But I really do believe that geniuses are grown and that the environment matters. And you take Mozart out of 18th century Salzburg and Vienna, and he's not Mozart. I mean, I don't know how many people in this room have heard of Thomas Adès. He's the best known classical composer of our day. Is he less talented than Mozart? Or are we just living in a different time when classical music is not appreciated the way it was in 18th century Vienna?
So one of the ideas that comes through in the book is this idea of not just the individual genius, but their milieu, and the idea of genius clusters, which I think I heard you joke on, maybe it was NPR or somewhere else, is, sounds like a nice breakfast cereal for your kids, If you just eat your genius clusters for breakfast.
You'll be smarter. Yeah.
Right. But tell us more about that concept of clusters and groups
So just look at a map, look at a world map historically, and look at where the geniuses appear. It's not random. It's not like, oh, there's one genius in Bolivia, one in Siberia, there's one in South Miami, It doesn't work that way. Nothing against South Miami, by the way. But it doesn't work that way. They appear in groupings, in these clusters, whether it's, Athens with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Aristophanes, I could go on, or it's Renaissance Florence, or it's some lesser known places that I explore, such as Edinburgh in the late 18th century, or Hangzhou, China in the 13th century, or Calcutta in the late 19th, early 20th century, or Silicon Valley, if you do believe that people of Silicon Valley are geniuses today. So I mean, it's clear, it can't just be chance that these clusters form. Something was in the water, or they were smoking something, or whatever metaphor you want to use. And the question is, can we bottle it, or can we legalize it, like they have in Colorado? And what lessons can we learn from it? And I try to do that. This may not be a scholarly book, but I think it's a well-researched book. I read a lot of academic papers, so you don't have to. And I try to distill the essence of what they found. There's sort of a burgeoning field of the science of genius. It has a terrible name of historiometrics.
Yeah, that's a mouthful.
It is, historiometrics, which is essentially using social science and statistics to try to study these golden ages.
Well, it also seems to overlap a little bit with the science of, studying birth order and all of these things. And one of the fascinating things that I think came out of your research was the extent to which more geniuses have been, for example, only children. Parents focusing on the success of one child? Do they have, any reason why that might be?
Possibly.
Beyond the obvious.
They're forced to grow up sooner. They have one foot in the world of children and the imagination, and 1 foot in the adult world. I mean, I could paint for you this sort of statistical composite sketch of a genius, again, based on what we know statistically about what's more or less likely. So your typical genius would be an only child, would have suffered some trauma at a young age, usually the death of a parent. They might more likely be left-handed and have suffered an illness at a young age. Aldous Huxley was mostly blind, and there's a long line of people who were dyslexic who became geniuses. Your genius also is more likely to be an immigrant or a refugee, someone who's been uprooted in their life.
That's one of the most fascinating ones, considering the debate in the country right now over immigration and refugees, etc. I know you have a piece coming out in the Wall Street Journal, is it this weekend? Focusing on, inshallah, God willing, on that. Look for it soon, at any rate. But, you know, the question being, you know, is there something about being an insider, outsider, on sort of on the margins as people who are sometimes immigrants or children of immigrants are, that leads to the, you know, the conditions for creativity and thinking out of the box?
Well, I mean, I think the typical, we all sort of sense that immigrants can be very successful. And the typical sort of narrative around the immigrant success is they come to the new country, they're hungrier, right? They want it. They work hard, they have a supportive family, then they succeed. Well, that might explain their success, but does it really explain why they're more creative? You know, because that's not just a matter of hard work. It's a matter of perspective. But what does the genius or the immigrant bring? They bring a fresh perspective, and they are outsiders. And every genius through the ages has been an outsider, because if you're fully invested in the status quo, you know, you're not going to rock that boat. You know, you need to be on the outside, but not too far outside. Middle ground of being an insider, outsider, far enough outside the system to see it freshly, but close enough inside so that your ideas resonate. You know, there's this psychological term of a schema violation. Have you heard of a schema violation?
No, I'm lying.
Okay, you're shaking your head. I thought, wow.
You know, you do that in interviews, yes.
Yeah,
no, but
violation.
keep going, keep going.
So if you were to have pancakes for breakfast, that would be a schema violation. You know, if you were to read the end of a book first and then the beginning, that would be a schema violation. It's when temporally or spatially things are turned upside down. And there are a group of scientists in the Netherlands who've been studying this, and they have induced a schema violation in the lab and had, sounds painful frankly, but they would have people do these tasks upside down or watch other people do them upside down and then give them a creative thinking exam. And those people who have had their schemas violated, so to speak, will be more creative than the others. And if you think about that, that's sort of what the immigrant or refugee faces every day. Things are upside down, things are a little topsy-turvy. And that's true of these people, and that's true of the places I encounter. They're not ordinary places, and they're not expected. They're not the places you'd put your money on to be a next golden age.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that I really loved about the parts of the book that I've been able to get through in just the week that, less than a week that I was able to get it from the publisher, and I've been reading parts of it and loving that, you know, as you said, there are parts that you would expect maybe Athens or Vienna. You didn't expect Calcutta necessarily. I know you were based in India at one point. Could you give us a little example of what you found in Calcutta what we learn about genius in the book?
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, Calcutta is probably more associated with desperate poverty, Mother Teresa, than it is with genius. But for a while, in the late 19th, early 20th century, it was a golden age. It produced dozens of writers, including Rabindranath Tagore, who was a poet, essayist, and artist, and many other things, a true Renaissance man, and the first non-Westerner to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And also scientists. And more books were published in Calcutta than any place in the world except for London at the time. And if you've ever been to Calcutta or any place in India, you know that it's a chaotic place. It was then, it is now. And it seemed to me the perfect place, A, to tell people about this sort of hidden golden age that most people don't know about. In India, it's known as the Bengal Renaissance, the Bengalis being the ethnic group from that part of India. But B, to explore just in general this connection between chaos and creativity. And I dived into the scary world of chaos theory and complex adaptive systems and a lot of physics. And there's a handful of academics who are looking into this connection, because we often use the term chaos synonymously with anarchy, and it's not the same. Chaos serves a purpose. Chaos is, there are hidden orders in chaos, and chaos is usually a temporary phenomenon to get from one stage to another. And if you think about it, every creative breakthrough, you've got to go through that chaotic stage.
You know, as I've been thinking about the book Ingenious, and I was wondering, you know, as you were working on this book, you must have come across people who, you know, in the educational world who get their backs up about the whole concept of genius. You know, is there, you know, it's a very amorphous sort of concept. You know, I've got young kids, and, you know, my son is 5, and people are saying, well, you have to get him tested for gifted because you want him in the gifted track in school, and, you know, and this kind of like almost overemphasis on every, you know, everyone who's doing well, you know, let's make sure they've got the gifted label. Some of these people had the genius label while they were alive, and then some only after.
Right.
Afterwards, and I wonder, you know, what are some of the implications of labeling genius or aiming for it, and keeping in mind, I know that you mentioned your daughter in the book, and
Right.
and you know, I'm sure there are a lot of people out here who wonder, you know, what should it tell us as parents, as educators, as just members of society, of what do we want to encourage?
Well, I mean, do you think we overuse the word genius?
Sometimes, or at least, you know, education, I think people overuse gifted, or at least it's become a kind of controversial term that's
Right.
debatable. You know, how helpful
Well,
is
does
it?
sort of
Does it
imply
track
you-
children
you've
too
got
early
it or-
on?
You've
Yeah.
got it or you don't have it, right? It implies-
Something like that. You know,
it
tracking
implies that.
children from when they're 5 years old, you know, who are the smart ones and who are the average ones. I think
I think
it's
it becomes,
troubling,
I think
yeah.
it becomes self-fulfilling.
Right.
And I think by subscribing to the genetic theory of genius, I think it lets the rest of us off the hook. So you can say, oh, I wish I could play music like that, but I've got no musical talent. What can I do? And reach for the remote and the beer and say, you know, I just don't have it. But what if just that part of you has not been activated? What if your genetic makeup is a range of possibilities just waiting to be activated? And if you tell children from a young age, you're gifted, you're not, you're reinforcing the idea that, or decreasing the likelihood, let's put it that way, that any talent and ability will be activated in the non-gifted section. And as far as parenting in general, because that topic does come up a lot, I guess one of the lessons I took away from the book is that genius requires constraints. You know, not just, you know, giving your child or your employee, for that matter, everything they need to be creative. You know, in fact, creativity happens when we're pushing up against something. And they've done studies where they, you know, will give people, one group of people, a lot of material to build a collage and lots of options, and a second group of people with much fewer materials and fewer options, and it's the second group that produces the more creative work. We need something to push against. So I do worry, I guess, if by over-parenting, helicopter parenting, or I guess drone parenting we call it these days, you're taking away those constraints. I frankly also worry about that in some firms in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, where people don't have to do their laundry or worry about food or coffee and just need to slouch into a beanbag chair and think deep thoughts. Have you ever tried pushing against a beanbag chair? There's nothing.
They're hard to get out of. I
Yeah,
know.
that's
They're in
right.
my kids' room.
Nothing
You
to
get-
push against, literally. So, and that was true in Athens and Florence and all these places. Life was difficult. In Florence, one of the most amazing things is the Renaissance blossomed a mere 2 decades after the Black Death wiped out a third of the city. It was devastating. It was terrible. But it turned out, I think, to be a good thing because it opened up doors. Because the person on the other side of the door was probably now dead. And that sounds harsh, but it's often some catastrophe predates these golden ages. In Athens, the city was sacked by the Persians. The Athenians won, but they lost their city, and then they had to rebuild it. And that's when Pericles decided to build the Acropolis and the other great monuments of today. So it's sort of the law of unintended consequences, but in a good way. We tend to just think of it in a bad way. The law of unintended consequences works both ways.
You know, it's interesting as you bring the book to the current age into Silicon Valley, and I know there are, you know, some people who are fascinated with that, and some people say, well, that's that's business entrepreneurship and inventing technology, but is that really genius? And you, as you pointed out in your wonderful introduction there, that every golden age comes to an end, and some people are kind of questioning,
Right.
should we put Silicon Valley and a Steve Jobs on the same level as the classic genius that we're speaking
Right.
about? Where did you come down on that?
Well, let's take Steve Jobs as an example, since he's the poster boy for Silicon Valley. So a little audience participation here. If you think that Steve Jobs was a genius, please raise your hand. Or raise your iPhone, as the case may be. Okay? If you don't think Steve Jobs was a genius, raise your hand.
If you saw that CNN documentary like a week ago that questioned that, raise your hand. Okay, a few people saw that. So okay.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I thought it was kind of divided, or did you take a tally there?
I think people were impacted by the CNN documentary.
think so?
Yes, I do.
So we have to
Media
take
is
the margin of error
terribly
into account.
mind controlling. No, I'm kidding.
I think
Yeah.
that the people are remarkably divided on that question. That says a lot about us, because the people who say he was a genius whip out their iPhone and say, "Oh my God, look, he made this. It changed the world." So they're judging it by usefulness, right? He created something impactful, and that's certainly one definition of genius, or one ingredient for the genius puzzle. But other people will say, no, he didn't really invent anything. And maybe he was a marketing genius or a technology genius. Now, whenever you have to modify the word genius, that's not good. If you say, "Oh, he's a marketing genius," it means he's not really a genius, or he's a bookstore genius. I mean, Mozart is not just described as a musical genius; he's described as a genius. We don't often describe Einstein as a scientific genius. So, just a genius. So, true genius transcends this particular field. But ultimately, what I conclude in the book is that we get the geniuses that we want and that we deserve. And what do I mean by that? I mean that. The epigraph for the book is a short, sweet one from Plato. What is honored in a country is cultivated there. What is honored in a country is cultivated there. What do we honor? Do we honor art? Do we honor literature? Well, I guess we do to some extent. But what we really honor is technology and all it represents in terms of efficiency and connectivity and portability. And so, of course, someone like a Steve Jobs or a Mark Zuckerberg will rise higher than others in the genius pantheon. So to that, and again, the example of Thomas Adast, the classical composer who doesn't get much attention these days. Why is that? Why did we have a Mozart then and not now? Because two things. One, if you're a smart, talented, ambitious young person, you're going to go to Silicon Valley and not to Juilliard School of Music, unless you want to go into acting or whatever. Second, is even if you are a brilliant musician, and there are plenty out there, there's less of an audience to appreciate you. So another conclusion I reached in the book is that genius requires an audience. You can't separate the creative act from the recognition of it. And we need our people, our co-geniuses.
Well, speaking of audience, actually, that would be a nice time to turn to our audience here and see if there are some questions for you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I learned a lot from listening to my NPR colleagues. But we'll do that, and then I have a few other things I want to ask about the writing process and your evolution as a writer and foreign correspondent turned into travel writer and nonfiction author. Public intellectual. I liked that one. Do we have some questions that would like to ask? Yes, please.
Yes.
I have yet to read the book, but I wanted to know if you had touched on at all on maybe genius is created by groups, by conglomerating, or just groups of people that are smart and then they make one genius. I want an example like the Dark Ages or the Nonconformists, how you have amazing authors like Ernest Hemingway who were a group of geniuses and became a literary success.
Yes, I mean there is such a thing as group genius to that extent, because I use the term compensatory genius because there were lots of writers who worked with Hemingway and it may have inspired him whose names we don't know, because there's usually someone behind the scenes who doesn't get credit who's helping the genius. We have a very romantic notion of genius still, and it's got to be one person for us. That's who the biopic pictures are made. The documentary on CNN was not a documentary about Silicon Valley. It was a documentary about Steve Jobs. But what about Steve Wozniak? Less well known. Maybe he deserves more of the credit. An example of someone you may not be familiar with is James Hutton, who was the founder of modern geology, and he's living in Edinburgh in Scotland at the time, and he's, you know, surrounded by lots of distractions there and things like that, and he ends up being the discoverer of modern geology, and he's a terrible writer, though. I mean, he just can't write to save his life. So he's got these new ideas about how old the Earth is, more than 6,000 years old. And it turns out, of course, he's right. It's more than 4 billion years old. No one had ever thought this before. But he can't get his ideas out there because he's such a terrible writer. He has a friend named John Playfair who helps him with the prose, who rewrites his work, gets it out there. James Hutton, as you look him up in Wikipedia, he's well known. John Playfair, much less so. So they're groups, but they're not equal groups. And sometimes they're truly invisible helpers who remain nearly anonymous. Like the priest at the Santo Spirito Church in Florence, who, when a young artist came to him and said, I want to sculpt and I need to know how the human body works, so I need to dissect human bodies, cadavers, this was not allowed. This would have gotten you excommunicated or killed. But the priest allowed this young artist named Michelangelo to do it. So there are lots of invisible helpers out there.
Another question.
So when do we come to the conclusion someone is a genius? Is that person still living among us? Do we have to wait until that person dies and then sees the kind of evaluate the effect of their work over time? How do you...
Death helps. Death helps. Well, it's helped Steve Jobs, to be honest. You know, and I talk about this in the book, it's essentially what I call the fashionista theory of genius, which is that genius is a social consensus, just like fashion is. What's fashionable? Is there good fashion or bad fashion? There's just, you might feel there is, but there's just what's fashionable is what people agree on. And we agree as a culture that Mozart was a genius, that Einstein was a genius. In the case of Van Gogh, it wasn't until many years after his death that people said, aha, he's a genius. Same thing with Bach and his music. So I really do believe that, I mean, I can't give you a number or a scientific explanation for it, but you know, without that social consensus, you're not a genius. If you were to go back to your house and work on a novel that you're convinced is the great American novel, but none of your friends agree, your mother doesn't agree, and no one will publish it, but you're convinced it's great, you know, are you a genius? And then say 100 years later you're long gone, but someone discovers the manuscript and publishes it and it becomes a bestseller and literarily acclaimed. When did you become a genius? I would argue when someone discovered it, that it takes both elements. Yeah.
Back to your idea of clusters. The whole idea that your grandparents were hunters and gatherers, your parents were farmers, you're a businessman and your children will be poets. How much does that graduation in history really help those clusters to form? And further to that idea, how much does wealth and power really consolidate that idea into a reality of genius?
I think I understand the question. You're saying people who sort of transition from being like...
Well, societies in general, whether it's Florence or the ancient Greeks, had a very initial phase as a very primitive people,
Right.
hunting and gathering, then farmers, then businessmen, and then they flourish as poets and musicians and sculptors once that wealth had been accumulated within the society.
Right, the wealth has been accumulated, but also used wisely. I don't know if you've been to Dubai or some of the other Persian Gulf states. There's lots of wealth there, not a lot of creativity. So wealth is, I would say, necessary but not sufficient. You have to know how to use it wisely.
So do you agree that sort of those clusters develop on the basis of that graduation from a very primitive hunter and gathering
Yeah, I mean, something interesting about so-called primitive societies is, in that case, and our anthropologists have looked at this, in a primitive society, if you ask people who's creative, they would say everybody is. And then as societies become more industrialized, advanced, if you want to use that term, creativity falls into fewer and fewer hands, but it becomes something fewer and fewer people are focused on. So yeah, wealth, and I have the chapter on Florence is called Genius is Expensive, because I look at the connection between the wealth of the Medici and the flourishing there. Because they were patrons, but they were good patrons. You know, my favorite story from the book is that of Lorenzo de' Medici, who was the most powerful man of the time, wealthiest certainly, late 15th century. He's walking around the palace grounds and he spots a young stonecutter, not more than 14 years old, chiseling away at a statue of a Roman god. And Lorenzo says, that's pretty good, but the teeth of the statue, it was half goat, I believe. It's an old statue, but the teeth are new. That's not realistic. Well, the kid fixes it. And the next day, Lorenzo says, wow, you did it. And he said, in so many words, you got talent, kid. Come live with me. I'm going to nurture you. You're going to be like one of my family members. I'm going to give you the best material, the best teachers in the world. And today, that kid is better known as Michelangelo. So who was the genius? Was it Lorenzo, the man with the wealth, or Michelangelo, the man with the talent? I think you need both. Yes.
My initial reaction to your book, I have to say, I was a little bummed because I was writing an article on large cities and diversity for an academic
Right.
article. So, and so I'm fascinated by this book. So the premise of our article was essentially looking at places where there was tremendous diversity, and this in itself
Right.
forces genius, as opposed to the genius is popping up from somewhere, but that these are the places that it's
Yeah.
the diversity and the multiple
No,
perspectives in itself.
I would agree with that. In fact, I'm a little hesitant to tie things up in a neat bow at the end of a book. People like that. I have a small bow at the end of the book, and I call it the 3Ds that sort of sum up what makes for these golden ages. And the 3Ds, one of them is diversity. Diversity, discernment, and disorder. And diversity, I want to be clear, not just ethnic diversity, because you can have ethnic diversity but have no intellectual diversity. It has to be diversity of ideas. And discernment is, okay, so you have lots of ideas, but they're not all equally good. And I think we do ourselves a disservice by pretending every idea is as good as every other idea. So all these places I visited, yeah, they were magnets for talent, but they were also colanders that sifted out the good ideas from the bad ones. And disorder is the chaos somewhat of Calcutta or any creative place that we talked about.
So, regarding relativity, what about, for example, military issues? Absent war, would that person be a genius?
Or would they just be... Well, you're talking about the domain of the field that people work in. Is that what you mean? Like you need a field.
Or is it absolute?
I mean, there's been some research on this and whether, and it's called domains, whether a genius is domain specific or not. Like, in other words, if music wasn't the thing in Vienna, would Mozart have become a military strategist or something else? You know, there are very few geniuses who have crossed over into multiple fields. And it's harder and harder to do it today because of specialization. And I sort of identify specialization as one of the culprits of creativity and why I really believe we have fewer true geniuses today than we did in centuries past. I don't know the question definitively whether, you know, whether the military historian has a military strategist has skills that are transferable. Obviously, I think some people, for some people, certain fields activate the full expression of their genius. And just like how many athletes have played professional baseball and professional football? Anyone? Probably. I mean, it's difficult to achieve both. And the Renaissance man we don't see Renaissance men or women because we don't allow it, really. Can you imagine if Leonardo da Vinci were to go to University of Miami down the road here and show them his portfolio and say, I got this artwork I did, they'd be like, oh, that's great, Mr. Da Vinci. You should go into our fine arts program. Oh, but I've also done some aeronautical engineering. Oh, well, we've got an engineering program. You'd be like, well, I want to do both. They'd be like, sorry, come back to us when you've clarified your career objectives. Or, meanwhile, we can direct you to mental health services. So I think specialization is a problem.
Fred.
Yeah, was there any relationship between age and genius? That is, you can stop it. The common effort is that basically somebody does their genius work when they're like very young.
Well, that's true.
And as they get older, it's sort of like, on the other hand, there are so many examples of people who have maintained in the creative area a level of production, genius productivity into their old age.
Right. It varies from field to field, interestingly. Poets and mathematicians do their best work while young, in their 20s sometimes, or early 30s. Historians and
How about writers, Eric?
writers of nonfiction work tend to blossom later. And most geniuses are extremely prolific. Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian Nobel Prize winner I mentioned, at the age of 69, after doing poetry and winning the prize, decides to take up painting and was a very good painter. And you don't hear a lot about a lot of geniuses retiring, do you? They may not do their best work later in their life, but they're extremely prolific. And W.H. Auden said that the major poet will have written bad poems than the minor poet, meaning that they're just producing more. Picasso produced 20,000 pieces of art, not all of them masterpieces by any stretch of the imagination, and worked until he was quite old.
We'll just take one or two more.
Why the term geography? You started off describing Athens beautifully as a sort of geographic. So in a literal term, geography means location. So did you find climate, location, or are you dealing with it much?
I'm dealing with cultural geography.
Okay.
It's shorthand for the places and the culture that exist in these
Did you
times.
find any relationship between?
You're defining geography almost like topography, because geography can also mean cultural
Does
geography.
climate have an?
I dismissed climate early on. I was hoping I discovered the secret was sunshine, because there are 300 days a year of sunshine in Athens. How does that explain Elizabethan London, which was not sunny at all? No, I found no relationship between climate. As far as like the land itself, in an odd way, the worse the conditions on the land, the more likely the creativity would flourish. Like in Athens, it's very, except for the sunshine, it's very arid. It doesn't produce a lot in the way of crops. It's a difficult place. Florence has no port city. It's not a port city. And yeah, I mean, there is such a thing as the oil curse, which is the idea that, again, these Persian Gulf nations have an abundance of natural resources. They tend not to be creative because they don't have to.
Just
Yes.
Just for my own,
Is this about Coral Gables? Okay.
you're not talking about intelligence necessarily. You're talking about creative
Right.
genius.
I'm not talking about intelligence.
So, to be creatively a creative genius, what role does intelligence play?
Not nearly as much as you'd think. There's many a genius who had only moderate IQ. William Shockley invented the transistor, won the Nobel Prize at an IQ of 140. Good, but not spectacular. Have you heard of 140? Oh. Have you heard of Marilyn von Sant? Okay. What has she created? Okay. So a column in Parade magazine called Ask Marilyn. So, I mean, I guess, and the point is, so yeah, I guess I need to be clear about that. You know, the people we admire throughout history are not simply the ones with the highest IQ. And in fact, it's been shown that intelligence can get in the way of genius. I know that sounds odd, but intelligence, just like education, if you have a PhD, you're statistically less likely to be a genius than if you don't have a PhD. And this makes sense. I mean, genius is not simply knowing more. Geniuses are not know-it-alls, they're see-it-alls. They're seeing connections that others don't. There were physicists during Einstein's time who knew a lot more physics than Einstein did. but they didn't make the connections and the conceptual leaps that he did. So absolutely, I'm talking about creative genius.
However, I'm sorry, if Einstein didn't have the IQ and the education, would he been able to make those connections?
No. But if he had a higher IQ, it's a law of diminishing returns, you know. And he had a very hard time earning his PhD. His thesis was rejected twice, I believe. But Einstein's secretary said, even if Einstein were among the polar bears, he would still be Einstein, which is absolutely wrong. You know, unless the polar bears knew theoretical physics, you know, because, you know, not to take anything away from Einstein or the polar bears, but you've got to stand on the shoulders of giants, and you've got to be in the right field at the right time. 50 years before Einstein's miraculous year 1905, when he came up with 4 major theories in 1 year, physicists were convinced they had it all figured out. One famous American physicist said, and I'm paraphrasing, "It's just a matter of decimal points now. It's all figured out." And that's not a time when you're going to see a genius, when a field is convinced it's got it all sewed up.
This young man has had his hand up for a while. Let me go to him.
Okay.
A lot of people I would identify from the Middle Ages as geniuses. I'm not sure whether you identify them. Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Maimonides, Aquinas, who were, when we're talking about domain specific or not, they were, you know, philosophers par excellence, you know, theologians, botanists, musicians, poets, mathematicians,
Right.
astronomers, all of that rolled into one, typically. And that was, it seemed to be something that was a product of that era, because we don't have so many of those in the modern world, although we do have, like, you know, math and a couple other things, you know, rolled into, like, Da Vinci or Descartes or others. Do you see that as genius, one, and what would account for that coming out of just one particular era as opposed to?
Well, I would see it as genius, and I would love to have written about Avicenna, who was a Persian. He was a medical man. He was a philosopher. He was many things. It would, again, as I said, it was easier to be a Renaissance man back then, or even before the Renaissance, because the fortresses of knowledge were not as fortified yet. You know, you could cross boundaries, and you know, you mentioned a few Muslim names in there, and I would have liked to have included a chapter on the Muslim Golden Age. It was my initial intent, but the real centers were the Baghdad House of Wisdom and Damascus are not that safe to go to. And as we were discussing earlier, I did not want my obituary to read, "Author killed while researching book on genius."
And these were all places that, you know, when I first met Eric 20 years ago, he spent more
Right.
time in,
It was
you know,
easier.
Tehran or Baghdad than Miami. But
And this
times
is-
have changed.
Please, and this is, maybe we can go to some more questions here, but
Yes.
They don't last long. They're fragile, these golden ages, you know, and maybe a few decades, maybe a century if they're lucky. And so if Silicon Valley thinks it's just going to be around forever and there's nothing going to stop it, you know, look at the Muslim world that flourished for a while, is not flourishing intellectually. China had its day in the sun, is coming back in some ways, but not in others. Yeah, when researching this book gave me a whole new appreciation for the whims of history, the cruelty of it all.
You know, there are so many questions, and they've all been very good ones, but I know that we probably need to wrap up quite soon. I want to give you time to sign some books for some people who would like to, you know, have a book and have it signed. And so what I'll do is I'll take 2 or 3 more, let them just ask them, and you can choose which among them you want to ask, or maybe you can somehow answer a couple of questions at once, as sometimes works, and then I'd like to end with 1 or 2. So let's just hear 2 or 3 more, and then we'll
I'll
let
answer
Eric try
every
to answer
question.
what he can answer. Okay. If you have time, we can,
Okay.
you know, can answer each one individually or together, but let's hear a few at a time. Maybe these 3 people.
Connection with what you were saying about physicists at the time of Einstein. I don't know if you know the story about Max Planck. When he was a young fellow, he went to a friend and he says, "You know, I like music. Do you think that I should study music?" And the friend says, "Well, no, if you have to ask, you shouldn't study music." So then he went to his physics professor and told him that he would like to study physics. What was the professor's idea about that plan? And the professor said, well, listen, in physics, everything is now understood, you know.
Right.
Physics has come to an end. So if I were you, I would go into something else. Fortunately, Max Planck didn't pay attention. And today he's considered the father of quantum physics.
Well, I think we're fortunate that he didn't pay attention. A lot of other kids would have been like, oh, I better go into something else that pays better. Thank you.
Well, that's
Thank
what's
you.
happening these days. You know, I guess I'll study marketing instead of,
Right.
you know,
It's
the
changed.
classics. Yes.
My question is less about genius than about writing about genius or thinking about genius, because I loved the book Geography of Bliss, and I imagine that thinking about happiness and writing about it, researching about happiness probably changed your interaction with happiness or what you think about it. At least the end of the book seems to suggest it. I wonder if that's true also for genius. What does thinking and writing about genius do to writers' feeling? Does it make one feel inadequate? Do you have less genius?
Boy, that's a
He's pretty smart. I mean,
no, that's a pretty good question. I mean, on the one hand, you're reading about these amazing people, Victor Hugo and Tagore, and they seem almost superhuman. But then you dig in, and they were pretty messed up. I was going to say something else, but they were not great family men. They had all kinds of problems. They were very, very human. So that's kind of reassuring. And they had their routines and they wouldn't just sit at their desk and do their geniusing, if that's a verb. They would walk, for instance. We haven't talked about walking. They would go for walks. Freud had a daily constitutional around the Ringstrasse Road in Vienna. 2 p.m. sharp every day he was doing his walk. Beethoven went for walks in the forest outside of Vienna. Dickens walked through London in the middle of the night. So I have picked up tips and pointers that way. I've realized the somewhat arbitrary nature of genius. And, you know, if I can get personal for a second, you write a book like this one, and you think it's a pretty darn good book. And your wife does too, but she's married to you, and she has to say that. And you fling it out into the world. And you've controlled at that point about as much as you can. And it's either going to stick or it's not going to stick. And just like all these geniuses did their work, now we can look back and say, of course Mozart knew he was headed for great things. He didn't know. Nobody knows. It's a crapshoot. So.
over there.
So have your writings and your meanderings led you to think about a next book on genius and mental illness and depression?
No. I've certainly read literature on that. There is a connection. I have no doubt about it. I need to write about positive things. As someone who suffers from bouts of depression, I think, you know, I've got to write about happiness, spirituality, genius. I got to keep it upbeat. So I am working, or will soon be working on a new book that all I will say is it's about practical philosophy, and I look forward to keeping that as upbeat as possible. Thank you.
We're looking forward to that. Since you mentioned that, maybe we'll kind of wind up a little bit on a writing question, because whenever I interview fellow writers, I always like to ask about their writing life, and particularly because we once both lived this similar life of being foreign correspondents and traveling, always having to deal with deadlines. When I usually had a daily deadline, as an NPR person, you often had an hourly deadline, and we're kind of always having to turn around the stories very quickly, which is a great practice and art form. But at some point in your life, you want to say, I want to work at my own pace on the stories that I want to work on, which is exactly what you're doing with your life now, which is pretty incredible. And we're excited that you're at this point of your third book with exactly that. What needed to change for you as a writer in terms of thinking book length and how you research and how you write compared to how it used to be when you were working as a daily journalist?
It's a good question. I would say the first thing that changed is I stopped using the word interview. I never use the word interview. I do not interview people. I talk to people. I hang with people. I might have a meeting with someone. But I don't use the word interview because to me, and as a recovering journalist, an interview is transactional, and it's, let's be honest here, a little bit mercenary. You, the journalist, not you, but just stand in for a journalist, you, the journalist,
Do it.
okay, are looking for something from Mitch, your subject. And so you want to interview him, and you come there armed with a set of questions. You know you're looking for something. And maybe if you're in radio, you've got a microphone. And you start off with some soft questions, and they get a little tougher. And then at some point, you know you've got what you want from Mitch. And you can't leave right away. That would be rude. So you ask a few more questions. And the point is, it's a transactional relationship. It's not a real conversation. So I try to spend just a lot more time with people. People I write about in my books have become friends. Some sadly have passed away before books have come to print. And I look at the relationship differently. It's, I'm still looking for something from them, but it's not as deadline driven. And I try to go into these discussions with them with no agenda, truly open-minded.
It sounds much more experiential as well, kind of allowing yourself to be in the story as opposed to worrying about, as you said, what exactly can I get out of it in the next hour before I go and turn it into a piece of journalism.
And I can say what I really think about people and places. I can say, I like Eileen. I could never say that in a piece of journalism. I like Eileen. But I can say that here. I can never say that Athens is a dump, but I can say that here, and not that it is, but I'm just giving you an example. And so many times I would spend like weeks in Kabul, Afghanistan, come back, file a bunch of stories for NPR, and my friend would email me and say, oh, I heard your stories, that's great. What's it really like in Kabul? What's it really like? This is what I try to do now through my writing is tell you what it's really like, or in the case of history, what it was really like. And to me, that's gratifying. Not always easy, I should say. It's tough. And the only thing worse than a tight deadline is a long deadline. But yeah, thank you, Ben.
Well, it's an inspiring story, a really inspiring answer to think about it that way, and just understanding better your evolution as a writer into this book. It's an inspiring book to read. I hope you'll get a copy. And thank you so much for being here this evening. Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you. And thank you to Books and Books. Thank you, Mitch.
And I'd like to thank Eric and Eileen. Let's give them another big round of applause. Beautifully done. Really beautifully done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks.
We'll now go to the important part of the evening in which you're going to go and buy all of Eric's books so that he can write the next one. We do have all of them up front, and see me if I win the lottery after. Eric will be over here signing as well. Thank you.
Thank you. You were great.
Thank you.